Hello, everybody. It's marvelous to be here, an enormous honor to be here talking to Tony Park, prolific best-selling author of The Last Survivor. My name is James Hendry. I'm a wildlife TV presenter and author of about a tenth of the number of books that Tony has managed to produce in the last few years. Tony, hello, and thank you very much for doing this, and thank you for allowing me to be here with you.
Hi, James, and thank you for being here as well, too. I'm a big fan of your work.
Thank you. We're going to start the conversation. We'll have a chat for sort of 20 minutes where I'll ask all the questions I've wanted to know and wanted to get out of Tony for the last little while. And then we'll open it up to the floor, and anybody else who's watching can ask any questions within reason. Obviously, you can't ask absolutely anything, I don't think. We'll see what Tony tolerates. And then a quick thank you to Exclusive Books, from whom you could get a copy of The Last Survivor and any other of Tony's books, no doubt. And Pam will post the links in the chat afterwards, and you'll also get an email for where you can get the books afterwards. Okay, right, here we go. The first thing I wanted to know is about research. I've read a few of your books now. This one is obviously a little bit different. I mean, it's largely about Cycad poaching, which is not something that I suppose many authors have thought, wow, that'll make a great adventure story about. Can you talk us through the research that went into deciding this would be a good adventure story? Because it is a rollicking good adventure story.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, in the past, I've written about things that probably most of our audience are more aware of. We look at the plight of rhinos and elephants and even vultures, which was something a little bit out of the ordinary I wrote about in the past. But cycads is a big departure, and I think it's interesting to look at where ideas from stories come from. They can come from anywhere. I have a friend in Zimbabwe who had to leave her farm in Zimbabwe, and amidst all of the panic of what do we take with us in terms of our treasured family memories and the equipment and vehicles and things, she must have had a couple of trucks because she relocated a significant number of plants, and I didn't even know what they were. And she was giving me a tour of her by now very crowded garden in the city, in the suburb where she lived. And my question as an ex-journo was why? Why? I can understand evacuating everything else, but why the plants? And she said, well, they're worth a fortune. And she then started explaining to me that cycads are, these unusual plants. I knew nothing about them. I learned they're related to conifers rather than palms. They've been around since the dinosaur times, but they're highly collectible. And there is this culture around the world of really dedicated, perhaps some would say obsessive collectors who will pay anything for the plants, legally or illegally, because as well as the market being highly regulated and controlled, I learned from my friend that there's a thriving underground market. She actually mentioned to me that it was such a big international business with cycads going to Australia, the US, Asia, the Middle East, that a few years ago, the American government, the US Fish and Wildlife Service, launched a 2-year undercover operation where a special agent went undercover to bust this international cycad ring. And at that point, the alarm bells started going off in my head. I thought, this is a story. It's something that I don't know about, but it seemed to have all the ingredients for a thriller. And then, of course, the research you mentioned is difficult. I knew nothing about plants, but that's not unusual for me. I often know nothing at all about the things I write about, and that's part of the fun of writing. And I approach this the same as my previous books. I've learned the hard way over the course of the 18 novels that I've done that one can waste an awful lot of time researching. You can waste, particularly on the internet, you can waste a lot of time. And I found the best way to learn about something is to find true experts in the field. And I was very fortunate that, starting with my friend, the keen cycad collector, I was then able to talk to other friends that people I knew and other good people that I met on my journey to learn about cycads. And they were people from the South African National Biodiversity Institute, SANBI, doing great work to conserve cycads. And another good friend of mine, Michelle Hofmeyer, who used to work in the Kruger Park as a botanist. So I drew very much on on the knowledge of experts, and several of those people were kind enough to then check my work. And that's how I research a novel. A longish answer to a very good question.
Okay. I mean, in a sort of follow on from that, it's not only Cycads that or the Cycads in the book that indicate a great deal of research. You talk a lot about weapons in great detail, the networks for poaching, the funding of terrorism into Mali, which was something I'd kind of maybe heard about but didn't know much about, and the tying of terrorism and poaching and all of that sort of stuff. Is that something you read about, or again, are you drawing on experts? Do you know people in these worlds?
Yeah, and it is interesting how a story evolves, and you know, I don't, you know, plan stuff out in advance, but what was happening as I was learning about Cycads, and it bubbled away in my back of my mind for a couple of years. I then had a course through my travels in Africa to meet some interesting people. I met a couple of guys, or a guy from Zimbabwe who had served in the British military, and he was working for an organization called Chingeta, which is a Shona word that means to take care of, Chingeta wildlife. And he was telling me about his exploits in Mali, where he had gone up there on a contract with the Malian government to train national parks rangers. And yeah, as you mentioned, what I learned was poaching up there in that part of North Africa, West Africa, is about money, but the money is used to fund extremist groups and terrorist activities. So poaching is a different beast, a very political animal up in that part of Africa. And I'm thinking, well, that would be good in the book. How do I combine that with Cycads? And then I learned, you know, with the value of these plants. I mean, an individual, even in existing plants, can go for upwards of $100,000 US. I mean, that's what you get for a very large rhino horn, you know. So there's big money involved in this. And I thought, well, this is something based on truth, that sometimes poaching is used to fund, not just to line the pockets of criminals, but these days to fund terror. And it's almost a case where, you know, you get a critical mass where I'm picking up pieces of information here and there. I'm thinking, I'll file that away for a book, I'll file that away for a book. And they all tend to sort of hopefully come together at one point. And then if you overlay a little bit of Firearms, because if I'm going to write a book about plant smuggling, I've got to hopefully make it, you know, a little bit action orientated. The books have a thriller side to them. And so, yeah, a lot of interesting stuff came into my head at the same time. And that's the fun part of the job, you know, learning and capturing and trying to weave that into a story.
Yeah. I imagine another fun part of this particular book was, well, and your others actually, but this one's got some interestingly unusual heroes and heroines in it, in so much as they are not very young anymore, which I found charming. It's quite fun. It was very refreshing to have these heroes, and I don't want to give too much away about them. Maybe you can just tell us a little bit about what inspired the cast, because it's almost it's an ensemble cast of heroes in this, and heroines in this book.
Yeah,
and it was unusual.
Yeah, it is unusual, and it's unusual for my books because I've tended, I guess, to have, you know, hero or heroine. I like to have a strong female lead. Hopefully, I quite often will have a woman as the lead character, and maybe there's another love interest or something. But I thought with this one, it would be nice to challenge myself. You know, I think as writers, we like to keep ourselves interested, and sometimes that means doing something different. And the idea for the group, and it's a bunch of elderly gardeners who also happen to like firearms, which I don't think is too far-fetched in the parts of the world we live in Southern Africa. But the specific idea to have this group of armed grannies and grandpas and garden fanciers is that when after my friend was telling me about Cycad, she showed me some old magazines she had from the Cycad Society of Rhodesia, as it was then known, Zimbabwe today, of course. And I read the AGM from 1979, and the notes in the AGM booklet said, members will please check firearms at the door of the venue where they were. And I thought this started to conjure up all sorts of ideas in there. And so they are sort of a very disparate bunch of people united by two things: their love of Cycads and the experiences they've had, some of them traumatic on a serious note. But the other interesting thing I find is in Australia, where I am now, where I live, I have served in the military, and I was in Afghanistan, but I'm out of the ordinary. None of my friends or peers or people of my age have, but most of my friends and peers in Southern Africa have, through things like conscription and things in the past, have a kind of a shared bond, a camaraderie, if you like, from time in the military. Whether you think that's good or bad, I won't go into. So I thought that would sort of round out these characters, and so I had a little bit of fun. It's different to the previous books in that I've tried to inject a bit of humor into the characters. I had a lot of fun writing them and their exploits. And one of the most affirming things that happened to me was after I had finished the manuscript is I sent it to one of my Cycad experts, and he read it and he said, "I think I know all of these people." He thought they were very much like real people in his Cycad associations or groups that he dealt with. So that was quite rewarding for me to find that. But it was a lot of fun to make up this cast of characters, and it is different to what I've done before.
And who would you say, I mean, given this cast of characters, what is your kind of target audience for a book like this and most of your other books?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting when I have to sort of market the books to new markets and people who haven't seen them. They look at it and they'll see, people with guns and stuff like that, and a plant and an elephant. So you're trying to cast a wide net, I think. Some feedback I've had from people who haven't read my books say, "Oh, well, are they boy books?" And I think when I started writing, back in the late 90s, and my first book, Far Horizon, came out in 2004, I thought I was writing for people like myself, middle-aged white guys. I've been very pleased and heartened to learn over the last 18 years that my audience is far more diverse than that. I think from what I hear from my publishers, if there is a majority of readers, they are women. And I'm very pleased to say that my readership in South Africa, I'm very happy. I have wonderful support in South Africa, and I'm honoured to be able to say that it's been growing. I think probably the thing that pleases me most is the diversity of my readers in South Africa, from all walks of life, all backgrounds, and both men and women. So if I can, I try not to write for a particular group or a particular audience or a particular demographic. But I write books that I like to read, and if other people like to read them, that's great. But it is particularly heartening for me if I get an email from someone and they are a young woman who maybe works from the local community near where I live in South Africa, and she's enjoyed the books, or someone from Cape Town's enjoyed the books, or people overseas indeed. So I don't write for a particular audience, but I think it is interesting to note that it's not just middle-aged white guys reading the books, which is very heartening.
Yeah. Yes, quite, because it's a diminishing crowd, which you don't want. The book here goes from the western side of Johannesburg in great detail, up to Vic Falls in great detail, down the Zambezi, along some of the private concessions on the Zambezi. Trying to think where else we go. Then we go around the Hoedspruit area. We go briefly to Hazy View. I mean, these are all places that are described, and I mean, I know them all relatively well, and they're exactly as I know them. So you've obviously spent a lot of time here. Are you spending a lot of time at the moment in Africa, and in which parts when you are here?
Yeah, well, my wife and I have an unusual existence. We live half the year in Australia. Normally, I should say, present circumstances accepted. Normally half the year in Australia and half the year in Southern Africa. Our base is in South Africa. We have a house in a game reserve on the edge of the Kruger Park, and that's our fixed base. And but we do travel a lot. In that 6 months, we would spend quite a bit of time on the road because of our love of the environment, our love of national parks, our love not just of South Africa, but of the neighbouring countries. And when I write a book, because I mean, my wife and I have been visiting for 24 years or so now, nearly every year since then. And we do live half of our lives on the continent. But I find that as someone who spent the first 35, 36 years or so of my life in Australia, that I don't have the residual knowledge that people have from growing up in a particular area, or having lived a long time in a particular area. So when I started writing books set in Africa, I found the easiest way for me to write was, as far as possible, to set my books wherever I happen to be at the time. So as you say, this book covers a lot of ground, because while I was writing it, I was pretty much in all of those locations. I can picture the trip, as you mentioned it, as I was writing the book. And I find that certainly makes things easier. You know, you're doing your research primarily by observation and immersing yourself in the local town and talking to people, getting a feel for what motivates them, how they speak, what's important to them. And it just so happened that my wife and I, in the case of spectacularly bad timing, we decided to join some friends to invest in a game reserve, in a game lodge up in Wangi National Park in Zimbabwe. It's a place called Nantwich. So we stopped in there, and I thought, well, I'll include a bit of that in my book, in an exercise in shameless self-promotion, but also because it's a part of Africa that I really love, and that's why we invested in there, and spent time in the falls, as you said, through Zimbabwe, back to South Africa. And so, yeah, so I write the books on location. And I do that because I want to, and I do that because I find that it helps me, hopefully, to capture the locations and to stay true to them. And as an aside, I like reading books where I know the locations. Like your book, even though You're in the Wild is set in a fictitious lodge, I know those people and I know that lodge, I think, in my mind. I like Dion Mayer's work and Margie Orford's work, because I can say, I've been to that place. And so I use real locations, real restaurants, real hotels, real game reserves, because I also write, I don't write for them, but part of my audience, you asked before, a large part of my audience here in Australia is expatriate Africans. So South Africans and Zimbabweans now living in Australia. And they, many of them have left for very good reasons and carved out a new life here. But I'm really pleased when I get an email from someone saying, this is going to sound bizarre, but your book made me cry because I remembered being in the bush in Kruger or being in Wangi National Park. Yeah. And I think you can tap into people's emotions, which is important when writing as well too. So I love writing locations, and I do very much write on location as far as I possibly can.
Just a comment, the other small bit of shameless self-promotion, which I absolutely loved, I giggled at hard, was when the manager of the Hwange Lodge is reading a book about an anti-poaching dog unit, which I thought was quite nice.
Shameless.
That you stuck in there.
Shameless.
Scent of Fear. You've got a copy of Scent of Fear.
I have got a copy of Scent of Fear right here, And so we never miss a chance for a bit of shameless self-promotion, even if all the books come.
I had a hard chuckle when I read that.
I think I have been accused of being a little bit too shameless on some of those little but I had a funny thing happen. I did that once before in a book, I think in The Cull, where one of the characters was reading a copy of Ivory. I'm not the only person that does this. There's a guy called Nelson who does this quite a bit.
Not.
And someone wrote to me who posed an interesting philosophical question. He said, does that mean that the people in Ivory, the book that character was reading, does that mean that they're fictitious but he's real? So I had never thought about it like that, but it was too much for my mind to get my head around, these worlds within worlds. So.
Yeah. In the action sequences, which are many, and I mean they're just beautifully imagined. I was never in the military. You were. How much of your own military experience goes into these books?
Well, my time in the military was a lot of this, sitting in front of a computer behind a desk in Afghanistan. That was probably the height of my involvement. There's a great line from I think it's from Stephen E. Ambrose's book Band of Brothers that, you know, were you a hero? No, but I had the privilege of serving in the company of heroes. So I have very good friends who did far more than me in the military, and I guess I was in Afghanistan in the Australian Army as a public relations officer. I was an observer. You know, as I observed things in Africa, I got to see a lot of stuff, and not all of it was good stuff. But I think writing action is like anything else. You know, they say in writing, write about what you know, and I think that's certainly good for people, particularly people starting out to write about what's familiar. But you'll inevitably have to cover things that you haven't done. So I've done quite a bit of shooting, but I've never been in action. But I draw on some great advice from the American writer Stephen King, and his book on writing, for my money, is the best book ever written about how to write. And King says a few well-chosen details will stand for the rest when it comes to description. And I think writing action's a bit the same. You can fall into the trap, as with anything, of getting too carried away with bombs and bullets and weaponry and technology and stuff, or you can just throw in a couple of little details. Hopefully they're right. And I think all of us in our lives at some point have been in a situation where we've been uncomfortable, or we've perhaps had to been in a risky situation, or faced a little bit of danger. And often in the case of writing, it's about capturing those feelings and amplifying them. I was in the people get hurt in my books, unfortunately. I was in the Kruger Park. This is my exposure to action and violence and things. I was in the Kruger Park in the south in Macmillan many years ago, and my wife and I had just set up our campsite and put our rooftop tent up on our Land Rover, and we were indulging in the time-honoured tradition of sundowners. And while stupidly trying to cut open a frozen plastic water bottle to get her some ice for her gin and tonic, I managed to put the blade of my Leatherman pocket knife almost completely through my hand. And there was a great gushing fountain of blood, and she was running around panicking. Of course, we couldn't get the tent down. She wasn't going to drive, and we were rescued by some fellow campers. It was all very embarrassing. And I was taken to the local doctor in Macmillan and stitched up, you know. And I had a terrible thing on the way back when we were in the car. Our new friends were bringing us back, and we finally gotten around to small talk, having gone through trauma. And he said, "What do you do?" And I said, I write books. And he goes, "Oh, you Tony Park, the author?" And I'm going, "Oh, yes." It was very embarrassing. But I clearly remembered, after having stabbed myself and losing a lot of blood, thinking, I must remember what this is like so I can write about it one day. Because I'd never been stabbed, fortunately, but through my own stupidity, I was able to do a bit of on-the-spot research.
Then I wanted to know also, you've done an interesting thing, which I imagine is almost unheard of, where you've given actual names of people to the characters in the book, right? Can you just talk us through that, why you did it, what the reasons were, and that sort of thing? Yeah,
I don't know if I got the idea from somewhere else. I have subsequently heard of other authors doing it, but what I have found right from the early days of writing or trying to write fiction is coming up with names is surprisingly difficult. You know, a name that's going to work, it's going to be good, it's strong if you want it to be strong or whatever. And then I had a couple of friends who said to me, "Well, you should use my name in a book." And so I did as a favor to a couple of friends. And then I got involved. One of the good things about my job is I get asked to support a lot of good causes. I don't do a lot. I don't do enough myself, but I behind the scenes, I get invited to speak at fundraisers for wildlife charities, for charities supporting people, generally in African context. And we came up with this idea that we would auction off names at charity fundraisers, and people would bid to have their name or a loved one's name used as a character. And it is phenomenally popular. And people will really, really up the bidding. I can say it's got nothing to do with me. I think it's people wanting to sort of have their name or a loved one's name, you know, captured this way, it'll often be the highest bidded item at an auction. And so the great thing is that rarely does your John Smith or Jane Doe, and there's nothing wrong with those names, they're great names if you're out there, John Smith, rarely do they bid for the book. It tends to be people with quite unusual names. So in this book I have Queen, because she insisted on being called Queen, Queen Jacqueline Smith. She paid money to be in the book. A lady by the name of Bay Elizabeth Pigors from Zimbabwe bid at an auction to have her name in a book. And you can't make up names like that. So you come up with some cracker names as well too.
Yeah.
And it's working for a good cause. And I think I'm at the stage now where, off the top of my head, I think pretty well every character in this book is someone who has made a significant donation to a very worthwhile charity to have their name in a book. So it's a lot of fun. And of course, as an author, it's great because that person goes out and buys 10 copies of the book for all their relatives and friends and everything like that. So
I think that's great. I think that's really cool. Lovely initiative. We're going to take some questions now. So if anybody would like to ask a question, now would be a good time to do it. You can post it in the chat section, and I will do my best to see any questions that there are. There was a question from Sandy Burrell, who wanted to know about the covers of your books. I wanted to know that too. How do you pick the pictures for your covers? Who designs them? Because they've got a specific style to them, which is extremely appealing to the eye.
Yeah. To tell you the truth, I don't have a lot to do with it. It's something that publishers spend an awful lot of time and effort on, just trying to get it right, to capture it in the best possible way that they can. So of course that's the South African cover that we're looking at, and yeah, they're trying to capture everything in there. There's a little bit of gunplay at the top. There's a Cycad down the bottom and some elephants. There's a bit of a subplot about some ivory smuggling in the book. It's a whole other world unto its own, and I'm constantly in awe of the people that design the covers. We have some interesting cover stories. There's a book here called The Delta, which has a lovely lion on it wading through the Okavango Delta on there. And when my publishers sent me the cover, I said, "Is that a real picture?" And they said, "Yeah, no, it was a picture taken in the Okavango Delta." And the lion had one thing missing. The tip on his tail was missing. And I said in an email to my publisher, "Where's his pom-pom?" And because I didn't know what the correct term, you'll know what the correct term is, a tuft or something. I said, "Well, he's got no pom-pom."
I call it a pom-pom as well, yeah.
Because he had no pom-pom originally. And she said, the publisher said, "Pom-pom, is that what you call it?" Ha ha, I'm going, "Well, I think so." And she said, "No, well, we did have to airbrush it out." And I said, "Well, why? Why would you airbrush the pom-pom out?" She said, "Are we talking about the same thing?" We weren't, because this lion was a very big male lion, and he was proudly displaying the fact that he was a male lion in the original picture. And the publisher, for the sake of modesty, had airbrushed out what they thought was the pom-pom. I said, "Well, now that you mention it, he's looking a little bit bereft there." But so covers, there's a lot of toing and froing and backwards and forwards. I hope I haven't offended anyone out there. International Lion Day the other day. But they are market dependent. I'm very proud to say, since hopefully a lot of our audience are South African today, that in South Africa my name is nice and big and the title is small, which means lots of South Africans buy my books, which is fantastic. And in my home country of Australia, the title is very big, but my name is a little bit smaller, befitting my position in the mid list of Australian authors. So I want to say a big thank you to all of my readers and friends in South Africa for buying lots of my books. You've propelled my name into largeness. So.
Then there's a question here. It's quite an interesting one, I guess, in that there is a Middle Eastern connection in this book. A hugely appealing character in Last Survivor, the prince, who's from Kuwait, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Derek Sumpton is wondering if you might consider doing a story using the Guptas as characters.
That's a very good question. A very good question. I actually read a book not long ago published in South Africa, and there was a fictitious South Asian family in there that were particularly influential. So I think it might have been done. But on a serious note, one of the things I find is, well, two things in fact, is I can never get writer's block writing about South Africa or Southern Africa. It's just not possible. If in the event that I just literally can't think of something to write one day, all I have to do when I'm in South Africa is turn on the radio or the television or pick up a newspaper, and I'll be confronted with a dozen of my ideas so absurd that my only challenge of putting them into a thriller is that nobody here in safe and sound Australia or New Zealand or the UK would believe that they would possibly happen. But the interesting thing is, I find sometimes that I've picked up an idea and I thought I've gone too far. Like I thought I've been silly, you know, I've made something up. You get a lot of dramatic license, obviously, in fiction, as you know. But sometimes I push it too far. So the premise of Last Survivor is that a plant that is extinct, a female Encephalatos woodii is miraculously rediscovered. And if that were to happen, it probably would be the most valuable plant on the planet, without a doubt. And I thought, well, I've made it up. But then the interesting thing was I was talking to some of the experts, and they say, well, you never know what's out there. And then I was doing a webinar with a group of people who were all very passionate about plants and conservation. Some people from Sambi were there, including a guy called Pakamani Zaba, who'd helped me with the research on the book. And a lovely lady from an organisation called CREW, which is about the protection of wildflowers in South Africa. And in the course of her, this is a really good point that I want to make, because it's really positive. She was talking about endangered plants. And she was talking about the mobilization of citizen scientists, as she called them, ordinary people who are passionate about plants, and they go out into the veld and the fynbos and they conduct transepts and surveys looking to locate and monitor various endangered plants. Those citizen scientists in the last few years have rediscovered 16 species of wildflowers that were thought to be extinct. So I found that very inspirational on one level. I think it's a really good story. And then you think, well, maybe it's not so far-fetched. You know, maybe stranger things have happened and real life things like this happen. So as in terms of drawing on people for nefarious means, you can also draw on real life for really positive things, you know, really good news stories. And I do, you know, I'm a sucker for a happy ending, and I do like to look for positives. And while I'm afraid to say that cycads and endangered wildflowers and succulents and things probably don't get the coverage that they perhaps deserve, given the terrible plight that they face. And of course, cycads I'm afraid there's far fewer cycads than there are rhinos. Not that we shouldn't be concerned about rhinos. But there's also rays of good news. You know, when you hear about volunteers discovering plants that were thought to be extinct, we need more of that around the world, to be quite honest.
Yeah. Then a lovely question from Bonnie Espy and something I wanted to ask too. How much planning goes into your books? Can you talk us a little bit through the process of your writing? Do you design the story from start to finish with a story arc? Do you just start and let it unfold? How does it work for you?
Yeah, good question. No planning at all whatsoever. The first novel that I had time to sit down and write after I gave up my job many years ago with the support of my wife, I did what most of the writing textbooks tell you. I plotted it out meticulously. I had this whole story worked out from beginning to end. I knew who all the characters were before I started, and I sat down to write it. And this was going to be the crowning moment of my life. I had given up my pretty good day job to follow my dream. And at the end of the allotted 6 months, I had finished this manuscript that was probably the worst book I've ever read in my entire life. No, definitely the worst book I've ever read in my entire life. And the two things that struck me about it is, here was me following my dream, and I hadn't enjoyed it. I found it a very mundane, workmanlike kind of exercise. It's like being an architect or in construction. You have the blueprint, and you knock it all together, like with hammer and nails or wrench and bolts and things. And that's about as interesting as it was. And I think it was reflected in the final work. I also found it incredibly predictable because I knew what the ending was going to be as soon as I started. So I gave it up. I went back to work, went to Africa, got the Africa bug, and had another go at writing a book, which was my first book that got published, Far Horizon. And I wrote that simply by sitting down in the Kruger Park one day, taking out the laptop that I had brought with me and looking around. And the first thing I saw was an overland truck full of backpackers. And I thought, I'll write a story about a bunch of backpackers on an overland tour truck, and I'll just make it up as I go along. And as my wife and I, we didn't have a house back then, we were just driving around. As we went from camp to camp and park to park and country to country, so too did my fictitious tour. And I just made it up as I went along, and I made the characters up, and it worked, and I got published, and I enjoyed it. And so every one of the books have been written the same way. I have a premise, an idea, and the premise for this book was cycads. The rarest cycad in the world is rediscovered. What's going to happen? Someone's going to steal it, sure as eggs. And maybe because I was talking to a mate of mine who was working in anti-poaching in Mali, maybe some terrorists will be interested in it. And that was the extent of my planning. And I just find, as a writer, I think, I'm sure you've got to be engaged. You have to love doing what you're doing. And if the way you're writing is not giving you joy and fulfillment, you're probably doing something wrong. And by trial and error, because I didn't even know you were allowed to do this, I worked out that what worked for me and works for a reasonable proportion of authors, perhaps not the majority, is to just make it up as you go along, trust the process, and, strap in and enjoy the ride, because you never know where it's going to go and you never know where it's going to end. So if people say, well, I didn't pick the ending, that's because I didn't either. I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know who was going to.
That's interesting. That book you mentioned about by Stephen King on writing is short and brilliant. And I think another piece of advice that I took from another book on writing was that your characters, if they're decent, they'll take on a life of their own that you will not be able to predict. And they'll do things that surprise you completely. And I suppose that's what you're talking about.
Very, very much so. And I think it's, there's some textbooks will have you say, oh, you need a little profile and you need like a file on every character and their background, who they are before you start. Well, real life's not like that. You meet someone, you think, well, I think you're a nice person, or think you're not a nice person, but you don't really get to know someone until some substantial time has gone by. And you're right, characters do start to take on a life of their own and they reveal themselves, and sometimes they're not the nice person you thought they were going to be. Or sometimes they're not as nasty as you thought they might going to be. And I enjoy that. And I find it, and honestly, it's the only thing that works for me. But I'm not discounting the other way. Sometimes I wish that I could plan and plot my stories and know at what point they're going to end and where the midpoint was, because there's a lot of uncertainty. I go through quite angsty periods. I'm finishing off a book for next year now, and I wonder if I've got enough. I wonder if I've done the right thing. Because there was no master plan. But I found what works for me. And Stephen King has in that book on writing, I know we both mentioned it, but it is for anybody out there. If anybody out there is interested in writing, it's such a great book. He describes it slightly differently. I think he uses the analogy of an archaeologist. He says that story is there that you're writing. It's probably buried away, maybe deep in your subconscious. And your job is almost like the archaeologist, is one word at a time, just brush away the sand and the dirt, and it will hopefully reveal itself. And it may not be what you thought it was originally, but it'll take on a life of its own.
Yeah. It's very interesting. And I mean, if you haven't read the book and you're interested in writing, but you don't necessarily like Stephen King's writing, horror stories, it's still worth reading. A question from another one from Derek here. How did you first discover Southern Africa? He says it's not a common destination for Aussies. It is relatively common, isn't it?
Well, probably not in 1995 when we first came, because my wife discovered it for me. We'd had a couple of friends. We'd done a lot of traveling ourselves when we were younger, and around Europe and Asia, backpacking as young Aussies tend to do. But no, Africa was kind of not on our radar and agenda. But in our course of our travels, we met a couple of people, who'd actually been to Zimbabwe, which was probably, You know, in the old days, if I say of South Africa, Zimbabwe was probably a better known destination in Australia, or Kenya perhaps, than South Africa. But my wife said, we're going to South Africa. She did all the planning. I had no idea where I was going, what I was doing. I've told this story many times because it's true, is that I clearly remember being in a cab on the way to Sydney Airport to catch a flight, saying to my wife, tell me again where we're going. And she said, we're going to South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Botswana. And that was my level of preparation for the trip. But I think it's also part of what happened to me, in that I had no idea, no expectation about what was going to happen to me on that first day when we picked up a little rented Corolla and drove from OR Tambo out to the Kruger Park. And I was so completely unprepared for what was about to hit me that I think that's why I fell so hard. I really do. I think it was I think perhaps you can over plan for trips and you might get it might have a different idea about what you're going to expect, but I had no idea what was waiting for me, and I had no idea of the impact it would have on me. So yeah, my wife, all credit to my wife for telling me we're going to South Africa. I'm going, okay, what do we do?
Cool. This is a very enthusiastically asked question here from Ian Crooks in Stellenbosch, which is a good place to ask this question. He says, how about a story based on Marcus Jooste and the Steinhoff conspiracy to defraud millions of people around the world? Horses and racing could come into it as well as a lot of intrigue.
I think it's fantastic. I mean, you know, it's like I say, you know, the things that go on anywhere in the world, but it does seem to me that a lot of interesting stuff comes to light in South Africa. You know, I'm a big fan of the media in South Africa, of sections of the media that have I think a very good reputation for exposing things like corruption and crime and lifting them. I've got some very good stories from the Sunday Times over the years, you know, about things that I've read about. And I never rule out anything, but one thing that I'm becoming kind of increasingly aware of, and people will quite often say to me is, and I've kind of tried to address this in Last Survivor, is it's not all about the Kruger Park and rhinos and elephants and big mammals and stuff like that, you know. And I think my appreciation of the natural environment and passion for it and my interest in conservation came from Africa. I never thought about this kind of stuff growing up in Australia. I should have, but I didn't. And I'm afraid that the more you see and the more you learn, whether it's about crime and corruption or the natural environment, unfortunately, the more there is to write about. So I never rule out anything, but I've had a few people have contacted me and said, look at things like abalone smuggling, sharks, and, you know, marine threats to marine wildlife. So there's a lot of, like, I'll never run out of ideas. I'll never say no to anything, because truth, I'm afraid, is stranger and sometimes far more interesting than fiction. And you could look just about any corner of South Africa or Southern Africa and find enough material for 100 books for 100 years, easily.
All right, we're going to start wrapping it up now. I just wanted to ask one more thing, Tony. You're a swallow who lives purely in the Southern Hemisphere, which of course is very odd. When are you here and when are you in Australia? What season do you prefer to be here?
Yeah, well, we used to come for 6 months at a time. We used to work very hard in Australia, save up our money and blow it all camping and traveling around Southern Africa. Now we're able to come and go a bit. My wife works in IT. She can work from our house in Southern Africa. We have favourite times of the year. You know, we live in the Lowveld, as you know. The temptation would be just to be there in the middle of winter, but of course it's also a very busy time of year. So we're big fans of the shoulder periods. I love May, you know, when the bush is just starting to turn. It's not so busy. You get those first kind of crisp mornings and the leaves are changing. And then because I'm used to hot weather coming from Australia, you know, I love the build up in October, you know, where it's getting hotter and steamier and the animals and everything is just bursting at the seams, waiting for that first big rain shower. And lot of our friends don't go to the Lowveld in summer or Christmas, but we love it there, the bird life and to see the rejuvenation of the vegetation. So we're lucky enough to be able to spread our time through the year and pick times of the year where we can have a bit of peace and quiet as well. And of course, we love the Cape as well too. So we love to get down to Cape Town also around Christmas time with some good friends there. We're very lucky. We've got a lot of very good friends in Southern Africa, in South Africa, in Zimbabwe and Namibia, and we get to spend time with our friends traveling around too. So yeah, as much as we can, and I think I'll be on the first plane out of Australia as soon as our government lets us leave. So.
Good. Well, we look forward to welcoming you back in South Africa, and obviously, the more time you spend here, the more chance there is of another book coming out. When is the next one likely to come? You say that you're almost finished.
Yeah, well, fingers crossed, I would say. Hopefully, it should be my publishers like it. It'll probably be, I guess, around about this time next year or perhaps a little later. We came out about a month early this year. I think it's important to note because the South African publishers wanted to wait and leave this book closer to Christmas, which is traditionally the big market time. But they'd identified the fact that people were doing it tough and that people wanted distraction. This book is a bit of escapism, trust me, and I think we could all do with a bit of an escape at the moment. So full credit to Pam Macmillan for biting the bullet and bringing this one out a little bit earlier. But hopefully this time next year, we should have a book set once again in the Kruger, Sabi Sands, Lowveld area, but with quite a different twist to it, is all I will say at this point.
But it's a rollicking good escapist story full of interesting characters, things you didn't know about nature, and lots of adventure and twists and turns, and I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm sure everybody who reads it will. Thank you very much for joining us, everyone, for this virtual launch of Last Survivor by Tony Park. You can buy it at Exclusive Books, otherwise you can get an ebook on Amazon Kindle, something called Snaplify. I have no idea what that is, or on Kobo. I probably know even less about what that is, but I'm sure you all do. And Pam Macmillan, who is the publisher, will post the links in the chat, and you'll also get an email the day after the launch, which is tomorrow, with the link to this recording and any details you might need to buy a copy. Tony, thank you very, very much for joining us, and thank you for a fascinating insight into the, I suppose, methods and madness, if you like, of such a prolific and best-selling author. Thank you.
Thank you, James. It's been great to virtually meet you. And again, I would say thank you so much to all of my friends in South Africa and supporters and around the world. And thanks for joining us.
Cheers.